Good morning, everybody, and thanks for inviting us to present our work today. So I'm going to talk about the Smart Villages approach to energy access and rural development. And in the presentation, I'm going to talk about why the name, why we call ourselves Smart, what the Smart Villages initiative was initially, and then how we started to look beyond energy access to rural development as a whole, what our findings were, and how we now approach rural electrification and development. So why smart? You've probably seen many statements like this. Smart cities are our future. I checked the other day, and before coronavirus caused all the conferences around the world to be cancelled, there were something like 100 workshops and conferences around the world every year on smart cities, which is great. But the problem is that half of the world's population and the majority of the world's poor people don't live in cities. So we think there is a balance to be struck between smart cities and then the rural analog, smart villages. Now, those of you who have grown up in the rural areas and villages know for yourselves only too well that in the evening, in a village, in the developing world, this is what life looks like. As soon as the sun sets, without electricity, it gets dark. And of course, once it's dark like this, life comes to a halt. There's nothing you can do. But just having a simple $5 solar lantern lets you do something like this instead. It lets life continue, it lets children do their homework, and all sorts of other things are enabled. So that's really the idea that we started off with originally back in 2012, that energy could act as a catalyst and could enable some of the game-changing technologies that would shift the balance of power from the cities to the rural areas, so that in a village, if it becomes a smart village, it's possible to have all of the same sorts of opportunities that you would usually have to go to a city to experience. So it's about that equity between the populations who live in the urban and in the rural areas. So what did we do? So the Smart Villages Initiative was a research project which ran for 3 years and ran globally. So we took 6 regions across the world, 6 regions of energy poverty. And in all of those regions, we carried out a lot of consultations with practitioners. We spoke to projects who were working on the ground, energy entrepreneurs who were setting up their businesses on the ground, governments, funding agents, NGOs, and community leaders and communities themselves, just to find out what some of the best approaches were to rural electrification, what some of the best business models were, what governments and funders could do to try and help that whole ecosystem. And in the course of the 3 years, we held more than 40 workshops and consultations. We spoke to more than 1,000 experts from more than 70 countries, and we produced a very rich diversity of reporting material from those, which you can find on our website. We also had an engagement program, so we had a lot of webinars, we collaborated and carried out a number of research projects, and we ran some international competitions for energy entrepreneurship as well. And one of the key things that emerged from all of that research was this question of, why do so many of these rural energy projects fail? And that's really a key to making sure that they succeed in the future. And it turns out that there are a number of reasons for that. Often, an energy project would have insufficient uptake of that energy from the community themselves to make it commercially viable. So maybe 10 kilowatts of generation were installed, but the community were only able to use and pay for maybe 2.5 kilowatts or 5 kilowatt hours on a regular basis. Poor management and maintenance of the systems was also a big contributing factor. So many systems were installed, but then they were remotely managed and maintained, and after a couple of years when they broke, nobody was there to fix them and they fell into disuse. poor governance and the communities not feeling that they had a sense of ownership of the systems themselves. So if people didn't care about the systems themselves in the community, they wouldn't try to keep them running, to make the most of them, make the best of them, to keep them active. No wealth generation. So if the systems just provided power and just provided light, of course, that's great. We saw in the previous slide what a difference even just a light can make. But if it's not able to generate more economic benefit to a community, it's just shining light on the same situation, and the actual situation in the community never changes. And indeed, if the projects don't bring additional wealth into the community from outside the community, then all you're doing is you're shifting the wealth around in the community in a different way, without generating anything new. And also the projects didn't address social disadvantage. So if it's the rich people in a community who are able to then use the electricity and get even richer, and the poor people are shut out because they maybe live further away from wherever the electricity is generated, or they're not able to afford to pay for it, or they're not able to afford to buy the equipment that can use it, or all those projects do is then just make the inequality in the community even bigger. So those are some of the reasons that we found why energy projects failed. So what we gradually came up with was then our smart villages model, and these are some of the key features of that model. So a smart village would have electricity, would have modern energy services, but those services would be a means to an end. So in addition to the energy, you would then have some other key services growing up in the community. So education and health and clean water and sanitation. And these projects would foster entrepreneurship, both in the provision of the energy services in the community. An energy cooperative may be running the systems and making money to return to the community and enable the system to grow, but also entrepreneurship and innovation in the use of energy services. So new businesses springing up in the communities to provide new products and new services to the people that live there. And through ICT connectivity and access to the internet, things like that, that communities could actually participate in governance processes at local, regional, and national levels as well. So suddenly a community has the ability to have a voice itself in regional and national debates, rather than just being on the receiving end of policy and decisions that are made in cities far, far away. And also all of these things taken together build more resilient communities, which are then better able to respond to shocks like natural disasters, shocks that we're thinking about at the moment, like global pandemics, but also economic shocks, the price of fuel doubling, or the price of staples like the price of maize maybe doubling if there's a poor harvest. So a more resilient community that's been able to build up resources and savings is better able to respond to shocks like that. And all of that in our Smart Villages model was enabled by access to modern energy services. So that then led us to explore the linkages between energy and energy services and some of the other sustainable development goals and the other priorities that communities have, and the priorities that project developers and development agencies and governments have for those communities. And one of the obvious ones to start with is agriculture. So most rural communities, almost by definition, have agriculture as the major activity that they carry out in the community. So the nexus between energy and agriculture, in a sense, should be a no-brainer for any rural electrification program. There's relevance there to increased output and efficiency and value of the agriculture. So when you have energy, you can get more information about what crops to grow. The picture shows you can irrigate your crops and increase yields. And then the value that you generate from the crop as well can be increased, because you can maybe process some of that crop in the village itself and capture more of the value chain at the community level, rather than all of that happening elsewhere. So this nexus between energy and agriculture really encourages village entrepreneurship and new business models, but it requires things like affordable finance and indeed awareness of the technologies and of the way that they can be harnessed. And there is a lot of innovation in this area as well, especially in the field of ICT. Um, Things like precision agriculture for rural communities and the ability to design and exploit new markets. So the agriculture nexus was a very obvious early one that we encountered and explored. Water, which is linked to agriculture as well, but especially linked to energy. It's not important everywhere, but a lot of rural communities have issues with access to water and access to clean water as well. So that's it. There's connections with agriculture in terms of water pumping for irrigation and processing agricultural wastes. And we found that initiatives were usually quite fragmented, and that initiatives to bring water into communities seldom explicitly made the link directly with energy, or then sought to use that energy more widely in the community. The potential for entrepreneurship and sustainability in these projects is a little bit lower, unless you're talking about water as a service and people actually paying for the water that is pumped, because then of course the payment can then go to pay for the capital investment in the pumps and the energy supply and the energy that's then used in pumping each unit of water. And there's issues around water quality monitoring. But this is a particular nexus issue where the benefit and impact on women and children is key, because where there is no water pumping, it's traditionally the women and children that have to carry out the back-breaking and very time-consuming work of fetching that water on a daily basis. The nexus with health is an important one, but we found there was a lack of reliable data here. In Africa, though, around 25% of health facilities across the continent in rural areas don't have any power supply to them. Because this isn't an area that had been explored in depth, the evidence of impact of electrifying health clinics was difficult to evidence, just because nobody has really collected the data on that very well. But there were some initiatives on general electrification of clinics, just providing power and light in those clinics, and improving the tools for the health practitioners, the doctors, the nurses, the rural health officers to use. Improved record keeping is an easy thing to do once you have access to energy and ICT, and also those standard services that you require in good public health, like lighting and cold storage, and the ability to sterilize equipment is important. There is a lot of innovation that could be done in this area, especially involving ICT, working on things like remote diagnostics and telemedicine. But in general, that is an area that hasn't been explored too much in a rural development context. A lot of the innovations there are still very much for urban users or for users in the industrialized world, we found. The link with education is equally important and equally useful for the communities themselves. 30% of children attend schools which are not connected to any sort of electricity. But in our work here and the research that we carried out, we realized it was important to realize that energy can play a role in education, but it's only one of many challenges which all combine together in the education field. So it's very important that any innovations here support teachers and don't replace them. And it's also important to realize that teachers who are struggling in schools which don't have a lot of resourcing also need significant additional training to be able to use ICT and energy-enabled technology. They are wanting that technology, but it's important to realize that also you can't expect to just supply technology like that, and for teachers in schools to immediately be able to use it. There's some significant training needs as well. And very often a bottom-up localized approach is needed there, just to see what is particularly appropriate and the most important in individual schools for individual teachers in different countries. And a one-size-fits-all approach, we found, really doesn't work. But energy and the connection with education could really support teachers and schools' sustainability. And we saw a lot of projects where, for example, having decentralized energy supplied to a school also then let the teachers maybe use that energy to let the pupils' parents charge their phones, maybe if there was no other energy supply in the community. And so that could be a useful source of income for the school, so that they could, for example, afford to buy the food that they were expected to feed the children with. And again, in the education field, there are a lot of potential innovations. So using the same sorts of technology for adult education in communities, and then creating local resources and local information and tools for community and cultural interaction. So there are a lot of possibilities here, which again could be made a lot more of. Resilience, I mentioned earlier, and we found that really this combination of decentralized infrastructure, decentralized energy and communications technology with the innovative service provision can really help communities become more resilient. So once you can generate your electricity locally, and you have a local way of accessing communications and maybe the internet, and you have a way of harnessing those technologies to provide local decentralized health services, maybe in education services, then it really doesn't matter so much to your community if the national infrastructure is destroyed by a shock. If a storm comes through and it knocks down the grid lines to the community or washes away the road, if you already have the capacity to be able to connect to the world and connect to your capital via satellite broadband, and you can generate your electricity locally, and you have the wherewithal to continue to receive financial services and education services and health services remotely, then you can continue to survive as a community. Whereas if you don't have that capacity, then of course there is no way to continue life while that whole surrounding infrastructure has been knocked out. And that's what we have seen in a lot of natural disasters recently, that when significant disruption comes to that national infrastructure, there's no option then but to evacuate those communities. Whereas if they had a way of being able to access all of those services on a decentralized basis, they would be able to stay in place whilst they rebuilt the world around them. And it's important to realize as well that that's just not for natural disasters, as we were mentioning, but also for resilience to social economic shocks as well. And some interesting work is being done here on hardening the technology that's necessary, and hardening that technology to things like adverse weather and natural disasters, so that it can really help those communities who are very prone to things like that to continue to survive. And of course, ICT in those circumstances can also be used as an early warning mechanism, and there are quite a few examples of that, especially in coastal regions in South Asia, where that rural ICT is being used to, for example, warn of tsunamis and warn of waves, and a lot of lives in fishing communities have been saved that way. And then there are some novel nexuses that we came across and explored in our project, which aren't usually talked about, but things like democratic engagement, using energy and ICT to ensure that your voters in a community are informed, that they have a voice, that they're able to engage in direct democracy, that they're able to access information about their rights, and that they themselves are just able to engage as a community in national and international debate. And migration, which is an often controversial topic, and too much can be made of the potential linkage for rural development and how that will affect migration patterns nationally and internationally. And it's not really something that's been explored in depth. But anecdotally, when we spoke to communities which came close to our smart villages model and had created new opportunities in those communities because of new enterprises and access to energy and access to ICT, they found that the migration of youth from those communities to the nearest cities was cut by about 30% as a result of creating all of those opportunities and improved livelihood options in the communities themselves. So there are a lot of other potential nexus issues which we didn't have the chance to explore in depth in our project, but which are interesting for further consideration. So the linkage between rural energy and access to financial or banking services, the access to connectivity, both in terms of internet connectivity, but connectivity to other services and infrastructure, energy, and how decentralized rural energy access could help internally displaced peoples, both within camps and then also when they return from camps to the areas that they originally came from. Energy and transport, energy and conflict, energy and religions, biodiversity, indigenous culture, and indigenous knowledge. These are all interesting areas for future research and ones that we have touched on in our original work, but didn't have a chance to explore further. And there are also some issues of global innovation here that come in, and new things that people are doing around the world that could really prove game-changing on the ground. So we are now all quite aware of the game-changing possibilities of mobile money and integration of that into rural communities. The possibility of then weather and crop insurance to make farmers happier to invest in higher yield seeds and inputs. In very dry areas, even the possibilities that are then created for atmospheric water extraction or purification of poor quality water through reverse osmosis or ultraviolet LED technology. These are all things that access to energy in a remote rural area can really make a possibility. Early warnings for epidemics. We're of course now in the middle of another pandemic, but in our research project, what we considered was some evidence on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa several years ago. And one interesting consideration that was brought to our attention by our colleagues in Nigeria there, the Nigerian Academy of Sciences, was that they said they realized that the 3 villages in which that Ebola outbreak started, if those had been smart villages just to the extent of having a communication link so that they could have communicated with a public health professional when they saw that some new disease was striking people down in those communities, a public health professional would very quickly have realized that the disease that they were talking about was a form of hemorrhagic fever, and those communities could have then been immediately quarantined, and public health and doctors could have come in and contained the situation and saved thousands of lives across the 2 or 3 year epidemic, a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars in treating that epidemic, but also, of course, the impact on the GDPs of the countries affected, which was estimated to be into the billions. So just from having a technology as simple as a mobile phone access in an otherwise unconnected rural community to a health professional, just to ask them a question about what is this new disease that we're seeing, and here are the symptoms that we're seeing in people. And there are a lot of other interesting innovations and experiments and projects that have been carried out, which could potentially be investigated and scaled up for innovative rural development possibilities. So all of this together then let us develop this idea of a smart village, an integrated development paradigm. So instead of just focusing on energy technology and dumping that on the ground and saying, right, this is all we're going to do, you look at the you look at the community as a whole and say, actually, what we need to do is address the needs of that whole community. And energy is just one of the catalytic technologies that will help that development take place. So energy isn't an end in itself. It becomes the driver to help that community with its food security, with its democratic engagement, with its health, with its education services, and in terms of fostering a new generation, a new flowering of local entrepreneurship and local businesses. And you can access all the details of that research on our website, e4sv.org, and in particular these two summary reports that we wrote about the whole research initiative. So just to summarize those findings, the framework conditions that we felt were necessary for that sort of new approach to rural development and energy access to take place were these 6 things. So firstly, to enhance integration and coordination. Currently, there is a huge silo approach in everything, in the work that people are doing on the ground, in projects, in the way that funding is provided, and in the way that policy is carried out. And we found, and we believe, that there is a real need to address village development holistically, to see everything as a whole, rather than going in with an energy initiative one day, and then maybe a health initiative or a gender initiative the next day, education the day after that. All of those things need to be connected. And there needs to be closer collaboration between all the players there, especially national ministries. So it's not really enough for energy to be seen as something that the energy ministry does, and everything else is something that the rural development ministry does, or the health ministry, or the education ministry. Really, all of those ministries should be working together in the context of improving rural development. And the same is true of development organizations and the public and private sector. And we think that it's really important to appoint a senior champion within the government of any country with the authority to knock heads together and to establish that integrated working across all the different stakeholders. And that will then create a more seamless experience for the people actually working in the communities, which means that the individual transaction costs of all of those initiatives are reduced because they're able to do multiple things at the same time, and it makes scale up of those activities and the impact much better. Supportive policy frameworks, almost goes without saying, but energy access needs to be fully integrated into the other rural development initiatives and backed up by high-level political commitment. So there needs to be supportive policy, but also stable policy that doesn't change from year to year, so that everybody knows how to engage and how to carry things out. And that provides clarity on roles, so that individual actors know exactly who to go to get authorization or get support for different things. Regulations that provide especially simplified and streamlined procedures. So many times we spoke to people trying to do interesting and innovative things on the ground to meet community priorities and really help them out, but they were being hampered in doing so by a huge amount of red tape, which was sort of involuntary in part, but it was really just because people hadn't thought that the regulations that were in place actually hamper some of these initiatives rather than supporting them. And ideally, there should be some sort of coherent and realistic national plan for all of these things. Building markets. We found it was much more sustainable and much more effective that things were carried out through market rather than by giving equipment away. Those initiatives that gave away equipment, even though it enabled them to distribute maybe solar lanterns or lights to a large number of people, we found typically those things then aren't valued as much by the populations that receive them. So it's much better to do things in a commercial context, and it's also much easier then to scale that up to multiple communities. Where there are subsidies, and the subsidies are are sometimes necessary, but they should be very carefully targeted and time limited. Sometimes we found subsidies that were actually mitigating against more investment and more development. And in fact, innovative subsidies, so subsidies of community uses and services, can be part of a sustainability model. So for example, if you have an integrated energy and development solution in a community, maybe that energy can be provided to all the community users on a commercially sustainable basis. But then maybe what the government could do is provide a subsidy for the schools or the health centres to be able to buy, their share of the electricity that they use to help the overall sustainability of the community energy system. Mini grids, in particular, that sort of scale of energy access, really require effective public-private and community partnerships to make them work. And there needs to be innovation in not just in the technologies that are being used, but in the business models as well. Access to finance, well, that's a standard issue and a standard complaint. But we just observe that to achieve the universal access in the timescales that are still being talked about globally, it needs an increase in the funding that's available of up to 10 times the amount that's currently available. And there's a need for better funding from the private sector. And there's also a need to reduce the individual transaction costs of the different projects. Science and technology, we need more collaboration between university research and the front line. So many practitioners said that they knew that they needed expert advice, but they didn't know how to access that or where to go for it. And there's an opportunity in general to expose, especially the youth in villages, to new technologies and innovative ideas, to encourage them to engage with it and learn more about it. And we need better methodologies to evaluate impact assessment of these projects. We always found didn't really go far enough to actually really describe the long-term impact of those projects, rather than just a short-term output or outcome of maybe how many people had been connected to a system or how many people now had an energy device in their households. And there are some more key areas for research and development, especially in storage of energy, but also recycling and control systems and efficiency of systems and appliances themselves. And finally, the sixth issue and finding area that we had was around capacity building across really all areas, evaluating value chains to see where there are shortfalls in that whole value chain of skills and capacities, investing more in incubating and advising businesses and entrepreneurs, raising awareness in communities of the different options and different technologies which are available, building capacity in the communities, from the community level right up to the governmental level, and almost the point that we started with, integrating energy initiatives with community resilience and the social capacity of those communities. And we found some cross-cutting issues as well. Maybe the most significant of which is gender. And we found that the key thing here was that there are a lot of differences between men and women in rural communities in terms of their experience of energy access and what happens where there is energy poverty, the impact of them, the opinions that they have about energy access and how that energy can be used productively. And that's in part because those traditional women's activities in some of these communities are the ones that involve a huge amount of drudgery and wasted time, and activities that can really be reduced once you have energy in a community to carry out those activities in a more efficient and effective way. And women in communities are well positioned to benefit from the new opportunities that energy access brings. They understand the household energy needs usually much better than men in the community. and they have a lot of strengths in entrepreneurship, and they have a lot of insights into prioritization of uses. So the gender is an important input criterion for any project, but also an important area of impact. And community is cross-cutting as well. Most of the project failures that we came across in our work were not due to the what and the technologies that were applied. It was due to the how. How are those technologies applied in a community setting? How are they integrated into the community? And so for our model, for our smart villages model that we created, it was really important that any initiative be community-led or community-driven, that whatever was done in a community was being done to meet the community priorities rather than what external people thought a particular piece of technology could do. That projects are, where possible, locally managed, that local skills are used in developing those projects, and that there is local capacity building and training to give the people in the community the skills to be able to manage and maintain the systems effectively, and that there was ownership and governance of any solutions at the local level, rather than that being due to somebody based in the capital city, or even worse, a company based in America or based in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, thousands of miles away. So from that research project and all of those findings, our next steps were to then continue with the policy engagement and looking at some of the nexus issues and looking at technologies and the outreach. But most importantly of all, to actually work with partners around the world to create some prototype smart villages, because we, having created this model, we were very keen to then demonstrate the strengths and the efficiencies and the greater impact of doing things that way. Because it's very important to have a word now about silos. So a lot of questions are asked about development. Do development projects really work? And you heard me saying before, if you don't think about how energy is used productively and innovatively in a community, then energy just ends up shining a light on the poverty. Education without anything else being done in a community just teaches you how poor you are. So we really believe fundamentally that it's important to combine all of these things together. But we found, somewhat to our surprise, when we took this model to large development funders, they liked the sound of the model, but when we then asked them if they could support project development along the lines of this model, they said that would be very difficult for them because their funding tended to come in silos. They could either fund an energy project or an education project or an agricultural project, but they couldn't fund something that was a combination of all of those, because the different funding streams tended not to collaborate in choosing projects. They each had their own ways of working and their own priorities. And so we end up asking ourselves if this very useful and very neat table of the different sustainable development goals is actually a help or a hindrance, because whilst it's very useful to see all these separate priorities listed, it does tend to make people think of them as separate things. And our argument is actually they shouldn't be seen as separate. They should be seen as things that all overlap. And for real progress, a holistic approach is key. So that led us to create this bottom-up integrated development model, the Smart Villages model. So we're not driven by any particular funding silos or any silos of different SDGs that we're working in, or indeed any particular technologies that we are wanting to roll out. We're driven by what communities need. And we think that by combining all of those different solutions together, as we said, very often those are enabled by access to energy and access to ICT services. But by doing all of those things together, you create a solution which is more sustainable, has more long-term impact. It brings economic benefits, so it's creating new customers and, importantly, for any government, new taxpayers. But it creates a solution in the community which is more targeted to their needs. It's more, it creates a more resilient community, a more empowered community, and it's a solution which, in the long term, is much more cost-effective. So for the dollars or pounds or shillings that are invested in the project, it's giving you much more in terms of the long-term impact and the benefit across all of the different SDGs. So what exactly do we mean then by this smart villages approach? And that's very difficult to say, because by definition it varies from village to village, but it's basically, it's bottom up. And in most villages that we go to, that we work in, it will typically involve some form of energy generation, a mini grid, whether that's for household use or just for business use. It will involve some degree of ICT and connectivity. It will involve the creation and enablement of some new businesses. Where possible, it will support health and education services. It will support social services in the community, so a community centre. It will support community cooperative initiatives. It will support the village government in how effectively they can work for the community. It will involve value addition of the existing industries in a community, which are often agricultural, as we've mentioned, and it will be very, very interested in the gender factors in those community, and particularly what the impact and what the needs and priorities are of women and girls in the community. And the benefits of that approach then are that you don't just look at SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, but actually you end up addressing all of these different sustainable development goals at the same time, and therefore create something which has a lasting and sustainable impact. So the next steps for us are seeing is believing. So we want to create some pilot villages, and we're working at the moment with partners in Lesotho, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and Somaliland to make that a reality. And because for us the impact is a really important part of this whole picture, and we don't think that enough impact analysis is done on sustainable development projects, so the long-term sort of impact and the cross-cutting impact, so that you know that, for example, an energy project hasn't just created access to energy for 1,000 people in the community. It's much more interesting to know that then, 5 years down the line, that created an impact on the number of people that were still in education, the number of people that had access to better health services and had better health outcomes as a result, that 50% of the women in the community felt more empowered, that new businesses were created. So that's what we mean by long-term, broad impact analysis, and that's the sort of thing that we're trying to do in all of the village projects that we're carrying out at the moment. And we invite you to join us in those endeavours. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.